In the autumn of 1888, a surveyor on the ridgelines of western North Carolina found a chapel that no map had ever recorded. The door was open. Beneath the floor lay a brick vault, sealed with lime mortar and silence, and inside it the remains of at least 23 people, arranged on shelves as if they'd simply decided to stop living. The man who put them there called himself the Silent Prophet, and for nearly 15 years the mountains kept his secret from the world outside. What he asked of his followers is a story that begins not with violence, but with a promise of salvation so complete it demanded the surrender of everything that makes you human. The mountains of western North Carolina don't welcome surveyors. The ridgelines there run like the spines of buried animals, long and narrow, and covered in timber so thick that daylight barely touches the ground between them. And the hollows between those ridges are so deep and so narrow that the sun only reaches the bottom for a few hours each day before the shadows swallow it again. Aldous Creel knew this when the county sent him to map the territory between Burke County and the Tow River in the fall of 1888, a stretch of land that the state surveys had left blank for decades because no road cut through it and no timber company had bothered to claim it. The blank spots on those maps weren't oversights, but admissions, because the land beyond the last named ridge was simply too remote, too steep, too tangled in rhododendron and pine to be worth the trouble of measuring. Creel spent 3 days climbing ridge lines with a compass and a chain, sleeping under hemlock stands with a fire small enough not to attract attention, because attention in those mountains could mean a copperhead, or a panther, or a man who didn't want to be found. The trails he followed weren't trails in any official sense, just narrow depressions in the leaf litter where something, deer maybe, or men a generation ago, had walked often enough to press the earth flat. By the 3rd day, he'd left even those behind, and was navigating by ridge and watercourse alone, reading the land the way the Cherokee had read it before the state decided it needed measuring. On the 4th morning, he crested a ridge that his instruments told him shouldn't exist, according to any chart he carried, and below him, in a narrow hollow, sat a structure of rough-hewn timber with a shingled roof and a single door facing east. It was a chapel, standing alone in a clearing that no map recorded, with no road leading to it, no cemetery beside it, and no sound coming from inside. The trees around the clearing had grown close over the years, their branches reaching toward the roof, as if the forest had been trying to pull the building back into the earth. Creel descended into the hollow on a trail that might have once been a road, but was now just a suggestion through the undergrowth, and when he reached the chapel, he found the door hanging open on one hinge, and the air inside thick with lime and something older, something organic and dry that he couldn't place and didn't try to. The floor consisted of wide pine boards nailed across joists, and in the center of the room several boards had been pried up and stacked against the wall with the care of someone who intended to put them back. Beneath the gap, a brick arch rose from the earth, its mortar cracked in one corner where something, maybe frost, maybe time, had broken the seal enough to let a thread of cold air breathe out into the chapel above. Creel didn't climb down into the vault that day. He went back to Burke County and told the sheriff what he'd found, and the sheriff sent 3 men back with him the following week, because a sealed room beneath an abandoned chapel in a hollow that didn't exist on any map was the kind of thing that required more than one witness. To understand what Creel found beneath that floor, you have to go back 15 years to the early 1870s, when the holiness movement was sweeping through the southern mountains like a second fever after the one that had torn the country apart in the 1860s. The war had gutted the Appalachian communities. Men came home missing arms and legs and pieces of their minds, and the land they returned to was the same land they'd left, only poorer, only harder, only more silent than before. Into that silence came the camp meetings, those outdoor revivals where preachers worked congregations into states of physical ecstasy, where people fell and jerked and spoke in tongues and barked like animals because the Spirit moved them and the spirit, they believed, was the only thing left that could save them. Most of the preachers who rode through those hollows were circuit riders, men who stayed a day or two and moved on, leaving behind a hymn and a prayer and whatever conviction their oratory could plant before the trail carried them somewhere else. Brother Enoch Vane was not a circuit rider. He arrived in the hollow between Burke County and the Tow River in the spring of 1873, walking alone out of the tree line, with a Bible held against his chest, and a stillness about him that stopped conversation before it started. He was tall and lean, with a beard that reached his sternum, and eyes that seemed to focus on something a few feet behind whoever was speaking to him, as if he were listening to a voice the other person couldn't hear. His age defied easy guessing, because the mountains aged men unevenly, grinding some down before 50, and hardening others past 60 into something that looked less like age and more like endurance, so he might have been either or neither. Vane told the families of the hollow that God had spoken to him directly, not in a dream and not in a vision, but in a voice as plain as any human voice, and the message was this: the world beyond the mountains was corrupted beyond saving, and the only path to salvation was a complete and permanent withdrawal from it. He preached with a quiet intensity that unsettled even the people who didn't follow him, because there was no shouting and no convulsion and no speaking in tongues in his sermons, just a low, steady voice and an absolute certainty that silenced doubt before it could form a shape in the listener's mind. The first 3 families who joined him had lost everything in the war, their men dead or broken, their fields gone to weed, their children raised on rationed corn, and the thin comfort of hymns, sung in rooms where the windows had been blown out, and the walls still carried the stains of candle smoke and grief. Others followed in the months after, families from neighboring hollows who had heard about the preacher who didn't shout and didn't rave, but simply told you the truth in a voice so calm it felt like the voice had always been there, waiting for you to be quiet enough to hear it. Vane offered them something the circuit preachers never could, not a promise that things would get better, but a promise that things didn't have to get better, that the world outside was already damned, and all that remained was to separate from it before the world took them down with it. By the end of the first year, the community numbered over 30 souls, and they had begun building the chapel that would become the center of everything, cutting timber from the ridge above the hollow and laying the foundation stones with their own hands, on ground that Vane had marked by walking the perimeter in silence until, he said, God told him where the door should face. For the first 2 years, the community in the hollow functioned like any other isolated Appalachian settlement, with the families working the land together, sharing what they grew, and meeting in Vane's cabin on Sunday mornings for worship that was quieter than what the Holiness Camp meetings produced, but no less intense. It was peaceful, by the standards of the time and place, and a stranger passing through might have mistaken it for contentment. But Vane wasn't finished. Then he announced a new revelation. He told his followers that God had shown him the root of all sin, and it was speech. Every word spoken was a distance from God, he said, because every word was a claim of the self, an assertion of individual will over divine will, and the path to true salvation required the surrender of that claim entirely. He called it the Vow of Silence, and at first it was presented as a discipline, a practice to be observed during worship and prayer, a way of drawing closer to the divine by shutting out the noise of the self. Within 6 months, the voluntary period ended, and the vow became absolute, because Vane declared that any voice raised in the hollow was an offense against God that endangered every soul present, and the community accepted it, because by then Vane had become the only voice they trusted. He spoke for them in every sense that mattered. He interpreted Scripture, he mediated disputes, he decided who ate and who worked, and when the days began and ended, and because none of them could speak, none of them could question. Daily life restructured itself around the absence of voice. People communicated through gesture at first, pointing and nodding and pressing their palms flat against their chests to indicate agreement or need. Written notes were permitted briefly, then banned when Vane declared that writing was just speech delayed, another assertion of self that the faithful had no use for. After that, the only communication was physical, and the range of what could be expressed through gesture alone
shrank until the community operated in a state of near total functional silence, understanding each other only in the broadest terms of task and obligation. The psychological effect was gradual and total, the way mold consumes a house from the inside, invisible until the walls give way. Without speech, individual identity began to dissolve, because without your own words, you become what someone else says you are, and the only someone speaking was Vane. People stopped referring to themselves at all after a while, because referring to yourself requires a word for yourself, and the words had been taken. Meals were eaten in silence, work was done in silence, and worship was conducted in silence, with Vane standing at the front of the chapel, speaking the only words anyone heard all week, while the congregation sat with their heads bowed and their mouths closed and their hands flat on their knees, absorbing his voice the way dry ground absorbs rain after a long drought, desperate and uncritical. A woman named Mercy Caudle went into labor in the winter of 1876, and in the pain of it, she broke the vow and spoke her child's name, a single word, the name she'd carried in her mind for 9 months, waiting for the moment she could give it voice. Vane was in the room, standing by the door with his hands clasped in front of him, like a man observing a ceremony rather than a birth. He placed his hand over her mouth gently, almost tenderly, and held it there until the contraction passed. And later that evening, he conducted the child's naming ceremony himself, in silence, assigning the boy a name from Scripture that Mercy had never chosen and couldn't protest. She never spoke the name she'd picked, and it died with the word that had tried to escape her throat, swallowed back down into whatever part of a person stores the things they weren't allowed to say, and the child grew up called Asa, a name that meant healer, though there was nothing in that hollow that healing could reach. By 1878, the vow had done its work so completely that Vane no longer needed to enforce it, because the people of the hollow enforced it on each other, through a system of glances and gestures that carried more weight than any spoken rebuke ever could. A hand raised palm out meant stop. A finger pointed to the ground meant kneel, and 2 fingers pressed to the throat meant silence. Always silence. And the gesture was used so often it became reflexive, a communal tick that passed through the group like a shudder whenever someone's mouth opened even slightly, even involuntarily, even in sleep. It was around this time that Vane declared the next phase of the community's separation from the world, and the timing was not accidental, because by then the vow had made the people so dependent on him that the idea of leaving the hollow had become as unthinkable as the idea of speaking, both of them equally impossible in a world where Vane's gestures had replaced language and Vane's voice had replaced thought. The outside, he said, was not merely corrupt but toxic, a place where the air itself carried sin, and where any contact with the people beyond the ridge would damn the faithful as surely as breaking the vow itself. All paths out of the hollow were allowed to overgrow, or were actively blocked with fallen timber and brush, and the community became invisible from the outside. Neighboring settlements noticed the quiet gradually, the way you notice a sound only after it stops. No one from the hollow came to trade at the store in the valley anymore, and no smoke rose from the chimneys on Sundays, and no children appeared at the edges of the tree line to watch the occasional wagon pass on the ridge road. A farmer named Holt, who lived 2 ridges over, told the county clerk in Morganton that the hollow had gone dead, that the people there had simply stopped existing as far as the valley was concerned, and the clerk wrote it down and did nothing, because the mountains were full of hollows that went quiet for one reason or another, and the county didn't have the resources or the inclination to investigate silence. Vane was the only person who left the hollow after the sealing, and he did it at night, walking out and back along paths only he knew, returning with supplies and with reports of the outside world that grew more apocalyptic with each trip. The cities were burning, he told them, through gesture and the few words he permitted himself in sermon, and the churches had fallen, and the government had collapsed, and disease had spread across the lowlands like a flood, killing everything it touched. The end was not coming. It had already arrived beyond the ridge, and the hollow was the last refuge of the faithful, because the faithful had the sense to stop speaking before it was too late. None of it was true, of course, but the people in the hollow had no way to verify it, because they couldn't ask, and couldn't leave, and couldn't read a newspaper even if one had found its way to them, which it couldn't, because the hollow appeared on no map, and the paths were gone. A traveling peddler named Green, who had visited the hollow once in 1879 to trade cloth for preserves, later described the experience to a newspaper in Asheville, saying that the people there didn't speak, not a word, and they looked at him like he was already dead, like his voice was an infection they were afraid to catch. He said he tried to ask about the price of the preserves, and nobody answered, and a man standing near the door pressed 2 fingers to his throat and stared at Green until he set the cloth down, took the preserves, and left without counting the change. Green never returned to that hollow, and he told the newspaper that the place felt like somewhere something had ended, not a place where people were still living, and the reporter who wrote the piece filed it under local color and forgot about it. In the spring of 1883, Vane announced what he called the final revelation, and the word final should have warned them, because a man who calls something final has already decided what comes after.
God had shown him that the ultimate act of faith was the offering of the body itself, that the faithful were not meant to wait for death, but to accept it when called, and that those who answered the call would rest in a place of honor beneath the chapel floor until the resurrection. He called this place the garden, and the community built it with their own hands. The vault was dug from the red clay beneath the chapel, a chamber roughly 12 feet long and 8 feet wide, with shelves carved into the packed earth walls, and lined with local brick fired in a kiln the community constructed at the edge of the clearing. The bricks were rough and uneven, the color of dried blood, and the mortar was lime mixed with creek water that set into a paste so hard it could be chipped but not crumbled. The entrance was a narrow stair at the east end of the chapel, covered by the floorboards that could be lifted and replaced, and when the last brick was laid and the last board nailed down, the vault was invisible from above, a room that existed only if you knew to pull up the floor. The first person to enter the garden was an elderly man named Obadiah Stone, who had been sick for weeks with a fever that wouldn't break, and a cough that rattled his ribs like sticks in a jar, and who by that point had not spoken a word in 5 years, and had long since stopped thinking of his body as something that belonged to him, rather than to the community and to God. Vane announced during silent worship that God had called Obadiah home, and the old man accepted it with the same quiet compliance that characterized every action in the hollow by then, standing when Vane's hand directed him to stand, walking when the gesture told him to walk, descending the stairs into the vault because that was where the gesture pointed, and he had spent 5 years learning to follow gestures the way a compass needle follows north. His body was washed, wrapped in linen, and carried down the stairs into the vault by 4 men who moved with the practiced coordination of people who had learned to work together without speech, and Obadiah was placed on the first shelf on the north wall, with his hands folded across his chest, and his face turned toward the east. The community accepted this first burial without visible protest, because it was one body, one old man, one natural death, and the garden was a resting place, and resting places were sacred. Then the disappearances began, and they weren't just the dying, not just the old and the sick, but healthy members, young members, people with years left in them, who Vane announced had been called by God during worship with a simple gesture, a point of his finger toward a specific face in the room, and the person pointed at would stand and walk down the stairs into the vault without protest, without hesitation, without a single word, because they lacked the words to protest with. The families of the called watched their brothers and sisters and children descend into the floor, and they watched with the stillness of people who had been taught that grief was just another form of the self asserting itself,
and that acceptance was the only faithful response to God's will. The vault grew shelf by shelf and body by body, each one washed and wrapped and placed with the same careful arrangement, hands folded, faces east, as if they were preparing for a sermon that would never be delivered. By the summer of 1885, there were 19 bodies on those shelves, and the room below the chapel had begun to take on the smell of lime and old linen and something else, something the people in the hollow had stopped noticing because they had no words to describe it and no voice to describe it with, even if they had. And still no one spoke against it, because no one could, and no one tried to leave, because the paths were gone, and the world outside, according to Vane, had ended. But one person in that hollow still carried a word inside him, pressed down deep beneath the silence like a stone beneath water, and that word was his mother's name. Asa Caudle was 19 years old in the summer of 1885, and he had never known a world where people spoke to each other. He was raised inside the vow, the child who had been named in silence, and the only voice he had ever heard was Vane's, low and steady from the pulpit, explaining the world and God and the meaning of every gesture and every silence, until the sound of that single voice became indistinguishable from the sound of truth itself. But something in Asa resisted, not with the articulate rebellion of someone who can name what they're fighting against, but with the dumb, instinctive resistance of a body that knows it's being buried, even when the mind has accepted the shovel. He felt it in his throat, a pressure that built during worship and peaked during the moments when Vane pointed at someone and they stood and walked down into the floor. A pressure that was not quite a word and not quite a scream, but something in between that wanted out. On a humid evening in July, during the weekly gathering in the chapel, Vane pointed at a young woman named Liddy Marsh, and Liddy stood and walked toward the stairs, and Asa opened his mouth and spoke his mother's name. The sound that came out was broken and rough, a syllable dragged across 19 years of silence like a stone across a frozen pond. But it was a word, a human word, spoken by a human voice in a room where no human voice had been heard in almost a decade. The effect was immediate and total, freezing everyone in the chapel, including Vane, who turned from Liddy and looked at Asa with an expression that carried not anger, but something worse, a patient, deliberate attention, like a man examining a crack in a wall to determine whether the structure can still be saved. Liddy stopped walking and stood suspended between the pews and the stairs, and for a moment the whole room seemed to hang on the edge of something, a fracture that might spread or might hold. Vane responded not with punishment, but with explanation, speaking softly, telling Asa that the word he had spoken had endangered every soul in the room, that the sound of a human voice in a place dedicated to divine silence was an act of spiritual violence against everyone present, and that the only path back to safety was through repentance and the garden. He gave Asa a choice that was not a choice: repent and enter the garden willingly, or be cast out into the corrupted world alone, where he would damn himself and everyone he encountered. There was a third option that Vane didn't mention, because Vane never mentioned the options that people found on their own. Asa ran, pushing past Liddy and out the chapel door into the clearing, and he ran into the forest along a gap in the brush that might have once been a trail, scrambling over fallen timber and through rhododendron thickets that grabbed at his clothes and scratched his face, running because his legs remembered what to do, even though his mind had never been taught the words for escape. The mountains don't forgive lost travelers, and the hollow was sealed and the paths were overgrown, and Asa had never been beyond the ridge in his entire life. So he ran in the only direction his legs could carry him, and that direction was wrong. Because every direction in those mountains is wrong if you don't know the way. 3 days later, Vane found him at the edge of the tree line on the north ridge, barely conscious, dehydrated, his skin torn, and his eyes glassy with the look of someone who had seen the world outside and found it exactly as terrible as he'd been told it would be. Vane carried him back to the chapel, walking through the clearing with Asa over his shoulder, like a shepherd carrying a lamb that had strayed too far from the flock. That night, Asa descended into the vault.
Whether he walked down those stairs on his own feet or was carried is something no record says, because there were no records and no voices left to make them, and the only person who could have told the difference between surrender and murder was the boy himself. And the boy was dead. When Creel returned to the hollow with the sheriff's men 2 weeks after his first discovery, they found the chapel exactly as he'd described it. Door open, floor pulled up, brick vault exposed, and the cracked mortar giving way to a darkness that carried the same lime and earth smell Creel had reported, along with something dry and organic that the men from Burke County recognized but didn't name, because naming it would have made it real, and they preferred it stay theoretical for as long as possible. What they found inside that vault would change how the county thought about the mountains, though not for long, because the mountains have a way of swallowing even the things that should be remembered. One of the men, a deputy named Suggs, who had fought in the war and thought he'd seen everything a body could become, climbed down into the vault with a lantern and came back up white and silent for a full minute before he could speak. The vault contained the remains of at least 23 people, arranged on brick shelves along the north, south, and west walls, each one wrapped in crude linen that had yellowed and stiffened over the years, each one positioned with the same deliberate care, hands folded across the chest, face turned toward the east wall where no shelf had been built, as if the east was reserved for something that hadn't arrived yet. The air inside the chamber was cold and perfectly still, the kind of stillness that only exists in sealed rooms where nothing has moved for years, and the lantern light caught the outlines of each figure in sequence, shelf after shelf, row after row, 23 shapes in linen lying in the dark, like the contents of a drawer that someone had forgotten to close. Some were skeletal. The linen collapsed around frames of bone that had dried and grayed in the cool air of the sealed chamber, while others were more recent, their tissue still clinging to the skeleton in patches of dark, leathery skin that the lime and the absence of moisture had half preserved, giving them the appearance of people who had been interrupted mid-sleep rather than interrupted mid-life. No wounds, no restraints, no signs of struggle on any of them, because they lay as if they had simply lain down and stopped, which, in a sense, they had, though the sense in which they had is a sense that requires you to understand what a decade of silence does to a person's capacity to resist their own destruction. Brother Enoch Vane's body was not among the 23 in the vault. They found him in the chapel itself, seated in a chair behind the pulpit, dead for what the men estimated to be several months, based on the condition of his remains and the calendar found beside him, a simple paper almanac for the year 1888, with every day crossed off up to early August. His hands rested on an open Bible, whose pages had been worn to blankness by years of his fingers, tracing the same verses until the ink was gone, and only the impression of the type remained. Ghost letters pressed into ghost paper, a scripture readable only by touch. On the table beside him sat a glass of water, empty, and a plate with the remains of a meal so old it had petrified into something that looked more like mineral than food. He had died alone in the silence he created, with no one left to hear his last words if he'd spoken any, which he probably hadn't, because by then even Vane had been living in the silence so long that it's possible he'd forgotten what his own voice sounded like. The county investigation that followed was brief and produced no charges, because there was no one left to charge and no clear crime to allege, since the bodies showed no evidence of violence, and the one person who could have explained how 23 people came to lie down in a brick vault beneath a chapel floor was dead in a chair with his fingers on a blank page. The coroner's report listed the cause of death for the vault occupants as unknown, and the cause of death for Vane as starvation, because the food was gone, and the water was gone, and the nearest living person was 3 ridges away and not inclined to visit. The vault was sealed again with fresh mortar, the floor was nailed back down, and the chapel was left to the forest,
which had been waiting for it anyway, and received it the way the mountains receive everything that stops struggling, slowly and completely, and without a sound. The chapel still stands in those mountains if you know where to look, though the trees have grown so close around it that you'd have to be lost to find it, and the silence there has a memory. What allowed those 23 people to walk down into that vault is older than any prophet and more patient than any god. In those mountains, the isolation and poverty and years of war and loss had already stripped those families of everything except the capacity to trust one more voice that promised to make the suffering mean something. If you want more stories from these mountains, subscribe to the Voice of the Ridge. The hollows haven't finished talking yet.